Okay, I'd like to speak to you today about the nomination process for UNESCO Memory of the World Register nominations. Just a short presentation on the key points in understanding the form and how to address and fill out the criteria. These seem to be the most important things that people have problems with understanding. So hence we'll do this, just bits of the form, not all of it, just the bits that are critical. First of all, the title. This might seem like a very obvious point, but it's actually something that's quite important. If it's a nice, short, catchy title, it's more likely to catch attention. So keep it simple, keep it down to 3 or 5 words, not a long sentence. Try and keep it short. A maximum of 10 words, that's enough. And there's a few examples there of the kinds of titles that are easy to remember, catchy. People will reduce it to that anyway. So try and think of a short framing for your nomination. The summary. This is a really important part of the nomination. It might seem like something you just brush over, but it's absolutely critical because people read this first and it gives them the first snapshot, of your nomination, what you're going to be talking about. And we suggest that you write it last because you've got all the information that you've assembled for the nomination has already been written about. You've got everything clear in your mind. So the most important points are what goes in the summary. So it's always a good idea to leave that bit until the last and then come back to it and once you have done everything else. We call this the shop window. This is where we put the most important things. You don't cram a shop window full of things that people can't differentiate. You always put something, just a few items you want people to look at. And in this case, we want you to look at the most important points about your nomination. You have plenty of opportunity in the nomination form to talk about all the things you need to talk about to describe your documentary heritage. There's many opportunities to describe all sorts of things about it. So don't be too detailed in this spot. Just 200 words is enough. So we're jumping on here. This is to the section 6 of the form, the identity and description of the documentary heritage item or collection, the history or the provenance of your documentary heritage. And what it's asking you to do is to set out the history of the item or the collection, its life story, or what we call provenance, from the time it was created to its place in your institution. So where it started, what happened to it along the way, and how it came to be in your collection. And this is critical to establishing a really, really important part of the Memory of the World program, the authenticity of the document. If we know everything that's happened to a document, where it's been all through its life story, we are more confident that what we're talking about is an authentic document, one that is real, a genuine article. Some of these documents, of course, are very old. You may not know all the details. You might not even have much to say, but as much as you can, you provide in terms of what's happened to this document through its life to give as comprehensive an account of the item or collection's provenance as you can. And that way it will help us to understand how authentic it is and that it is authentic. So this is it's very important that you address this criterion. And then we jump on to number 7, again, the assessment against the selection criteria. And this is really the heart of your nomination. This is where the arguments about why your collection is important, why it should be part of the memory of the world. These are the arguments you need to make that case. So the first thing we say to you is play to your strengths and choose the criteria that best express the qualities of your documentary heritage item or collection. And it's very important to understand you don't need to address every single one if it's not relevant. So you look at the ones that you think are going to be the ones that are going to best give you the chance to showcase your nomination, and you choose those. You don't try and address those that don't have any application. And you craft your responses to match the criteria. It's going to ask you questions about what's significant about this documentary heritage. Don't simply repeat material that you've put down somewhere else in the nomination form. whether it be in the history and provenance section or in the description or the cataloguing or whatever. Make sure you directly address the criteria. Don't just keep plonking bits of text in that you think is going to match that particular criterion. There are two sets of criteria. The primary criteria, and these are the ones we're going to talk about now, and there are what we call the comparative criteria, and I'll come to those in a few minutes' time. The primary criteria help you to understand the significance value of your documentary heritage for the world. Now, the way the form is set out has created a few problems for some people. We've noticed looking at some of the draft nominations that people have been putting a lot of information just under 7.1, which is a question. Does your documentary heritage item or collection meet one or more of the primary criteria? You just leave that. That's a heading. You don't actually put anything under 7.1 itself, under that particular little point. It's simply a section heading. You focus on the criteria from 7.1.1 onwards and address them under each of those criteria. You don't put anything under 7.1. That is simply asking the question of, does your documentary heritage item or collection meet one or more of the criteria? And as I said, there's three primary criteria. There's the historical significance, form and style, and social, community, and spiritual significance. I'm going to explain what all these are in a minute. But you only choose and address criteria that are relevant to your nominated documentary heritage. Not all criteria will necessarily apply. It's quite interesting to see how few actually fit under some of these criteria. I'm going to go and talk about the primary criteria now, just so that you get an understanding of how each of these is different from the other one and what you need to put in under each one. So 7.1.1 historical significance. This is one that is the most common. Just about everything we have in our collections, of course, has some historical significance. It was created at a particular point in time for a particular reason, under the stress of certain circumstances, and it has its place in history. So virtually everything has some historical significance. And there's a series of questions here that ask you, what does the documentary heritage item or collection tell us about the history of the world? Does it deal with political, economical, social, or spiritual movements, leading personalities in world history, events of world-changing significance, specific places of significance, traditional customs, relations with other countries or communities, changing patterns of life and culture, a turning point in history or a critical innovation, an example of excellence in the arts, literature, science, technology, sport, or other aspects of life and culture. Of course, nothing is going to answer any of all those questions. It'll probably only answer one. Whatever your documents you're looking at may or may not fit into several or indeed only one of those questions. But there's some prompt questions to get you to think about what is it actually telling us about the history of the world. So these are you don't need to put anything under each of these. These are just prompt questions that get you to think about what historical significance could be in your documentary heritage. I've got a few examples of what we call historical significance here today. Here's an example from Namibia in Africa of the lettered journals of Hendrik Witbooi. These are really important journals, but a leading African national hero, Hendrik Witbooi, and he struggled against the German occupation of Namibia. And just in the last couple of weeks, we've been told that the Germans are now going to pay Namibia reparations of over €1 billion for what they did to Herero and Nama tribesmen and tribes people in Namibia in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So this man was the first person to really develop the concept of Pan-Africanism. A very key figure. His letters, journals are held in the National Archives of Namibia in Windhoek. And I've been privileged to go there and see them, as some other of my colleagues who'll be with you in this workshop have as well. So he's a leading figure in history. for all sorts of reasons. He started a political movement and he's a national hero for his country, but also for the wider African community. So that's where he sits in terms of historical significance. And of course, the time and place is important to the time of colonial empires and the kinds of exploitation of places like Africa that took place in those times. So historical significance, of course, is clearly what Henrik Witbois' letters and journals are about. These sort of movements of people and particular labour circumstances. This is a story of indentured labour, indentured people who signed up to go and work in another country for a particular reason. So it's about a movement of people, economic forces push them to places because of the cessation of the institution of slavery in the Caribbean and in also the opening up of sugar plantations in places like Fiji in the Pacific. People needed labour and they imported labour. People came from places like Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname and Fiji, or went to those places from India. People signed up to go and live there. And of course, that changed the demographics of many of these countries. Fiji is now almost totally 50% Indian. Trinidad and Tobago has also got a large Indian population. So these movements of people, labour movement, in response to an economic situation, an industry that needed to have labour, and these particular documents are held in National Archives of Fiji. On the one hand, the one piece of paper is from National Archives of Fiji and the South Sea Island indentured labourers. This is another movement of people from the Pacific into Queensland in my country. Same reasons, sugar plantations needed labour and indentured labourers were hired from the countries of the Pacific, not often in the best possible circumstances. Some of them, what they call blackbirded, they were kidnapped and brought there, but others signed labour agreements. And these are the registers from the Queensland State Archives to talk about who came from the islands of the Pacific to work in the sugar plantations in Queensland. So that's about movement of people, economics, and about the changing demographics of particular countries. So that's historical significance. The second one is form and style. And this one is about the physical nature of the nominated documentary heritage. What is it made of? What it is like to look at? Does it have outstanding qualities of beauty and craftsmanship? Is it a new or unusual type of carrier? Because as you will have been told, a carrier is the item that supports the actual content of a document. Or is it an example of a type of document that has now disappeared? So there's all sorts of ways of looking at the physical nature. It's not just about, you don't put in, it is a manuscript or it is a pile of paper or whatever. If it's something unusual, something different, outstanding, if it's a beautifully illuminated manuscript, for example, or if it's something innovative in terms of documentation, or is it something that we don't have anymore that is now fairly unusual? So form and style is quite specific to that materiality of the documentary heritage. I'll give you some examples of what we're talking about here. This one here is a what they call a Nashi Dongba pictogram script from Yunnan province in China. This is an ancient script, an early form of writing. So it's a very unusual kind of document. And it's composed of little pictures. As you can see, a bit like Egyptian hieroglyphics, only a bit more graphic in many ways. You can actually recognize animals and other figures in those quite easily. And it is one that was very much an endangered language. It was suppressed for a long time in the period in China under the Cultural Revolution. And people were not encouraged to use it. But since that time, there's been some liberalisation, and people are now encouraged to practice and to write the script again. So this is in Yunnan province in China, a different kind of script, very unusual. And woodblocks, these were an unusual kind of carrier as well. I mean, they were used for printing everywhere, but these are the Tripitaka Koreana scriptures from the Heian Temple in the Republic of Korea. And they are, of course, very famous as documentary heritage in a World Heritage Site. But they are also, for their own character, their own nature, they're wood blocks. They're not pieces of paper. They're not film, things like that. So they have their own form and style, which is distinctive. And finally, in the primary criteria, social, community, or spiritual significance. And this one is quite hard to explain and quite hard for many people to grasp. It's about people's attachment to the documentary heritage of a specific community in the present. And you must show how this is demonstrated. So it's about people who are attached to the heritage of a beloved community leader, so that the things he or she created are, in fact, powerful objects that have people very revere them. Attachment to the documentary heritage of a specific incident or site. People are also attached to those kinds of things. And in terms of spirituality, documentary heritage is associated with a spiritual leader or a saint. Some belief systems have saints and other revered spiritual beings, and something associated with them. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, in Christianity, reveres saints. So things that are associated with them are essentially worshipped as part of their spiritual qualities. And you need to show how this attachment is expressed by a community. How do people show that they care about this documentary heritage? And there's a really good example in the Republic of Korea, the Human Rights Documentary Heritage 1980 archives for the May 18th democratic uprising against the military regime in Gwangju. It is people who went through this really bad time in 1980. Many people were killed. A lot of them were very young. A lot of them were university students, and they were killed. And it's very humbling to go to the cemetery in Gwangju and see the graves with pictures of very young people who were killed in this uprising. And the survivors of this uprising and the people who look after records in Gwangju have preserved these things in a very large archive, and the whole city of Gwangju has taken on the persona of human rights city. So the whole city identifies with this uprising as a key moment, and it's given them an identity. And you can see a ceremony and an academic conference around this particular, the commemoration of this particular event a few years ago. I think they still have one every year. Again, another series of records that relate to people being oppressed and being liberated. And this is in a place called the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo, the capital city. It's the Museum of the Resistance, Memorial Museum of the Resistance to the Trujillo regime. It was a dictatorship that lasted 30 years. The Trujillo was an oppressive ruler. Many people were killed, tortured, executed. There was massive resistance, and finally Trujillo was overthrown. And the survivors of that particular moment, created this collection of archives, and young people these days are taught about this particular uprising, and it's very much part of their life as well. So again, it's not just documents on a shelf, it's something people really relate to as a key part of their identity. So those are the primary criteria. And so you look at each of those and you decide which one applies, or if all of them apply to your documentary heritage, or just one. Let's just be historical significance or form and style. Usually if something's got historical significance, it might have social and spiritual significance, or it may not, depending on whether you can prove that attachment. The last set of criteria are the comparative criteria. And the first of these is rarity. And this is, of course, it means whether there's very few of these items still left in circulation. And rarity, of course, is an indication of value in many marketplaces. And the same thing happens in documentary heritage. So is the documentary heritage item or collection rare? And there's two ways of being rare. One is if it's one of a kind, if it's unique, the only one ever created. Or is it a survivor of a form of documentary heritage that was once widespread? And do you know about other documentary heritage items or collections that are the same as this elsewhere? Comparative criteria, I should have mentioned briefly before, they help us assess the degree of significance. So you've established your primary reason for having your documentary heritage, but these things talk about how rare it is or how significant it is compared to other sorts of documentary heritage like it. So you've got two sorts of rarity. You've got one that's unique, the uniqueness of something that's only ever been created once, or one that is the only one left after time has taken other things out. So a rare item could be one of a kind, and we've got an example here, the Benz patent of 1886 for the internal combustion engine from Germany. There's only one Benz patent, only ever been one. There's a number of reproductions of the actual vehicle. People have made these models that you can see here, but the actual patent, which is the design you see on the screen, that is the only one that has ever existed. A patent means that once you patent something, of course, you say, this is it, and you own it. And it can't be any more of that particular thing. But that's the one of a kind. There's only one of these. But a rare item can also be a survivor. And the book here, you can see here, is a document that was once common. It was a printed book. So printed books, of course, are circulated, that people have multiple copies. But now only one copy or a few copies survive. And we only know of one of these. This is a catechism. It's a Catholic religious book written in a language called Papiamento. Papiamento was the Creole language, the language developed in a place called the Netherlands Antilles in the Caribbean Sea. And this was developed by a missionary to the Netherlands Antilles, to Curacao in this case. And this was actually published and circulated, but only one survives that we know about. We don't know of any others in the world, but because people lose them, they get damaged and so on. So it's a rarity as well because it's a survivor. The next comparative criterion is integrity, completeness, and condition. So is the documentary heritage item or collection complete, or are sections or pages missing? You need to tell us. Are supplementary parts preserved elsewhere? If so, tell us about those too. And what condition is it in? Is it in good condition or is it damaged? It's just one of those things we need to know about in terms of how to assess it. So we come to the last item, which is the statement of significance. And this is, people don't, I think it's hard to see that people have grasped this one. But it is the most important part of your whole document. Because what you do is you summarize the points you've made in 7.1 and 7.2. So all the points you've made about the primary criteria, all the points you've made about the comparative criteria, and then you answer the following questions. So you've got a summary of historical significance and whatever else happens after that, whether something's rare or whether it's what condition it's in and so on. And then you address these questions. Why is this documentary heritage item or collection important to the memory of the world? You make your case. And what has been the impact of this item or collection on world history and culture? So what's its influence been? And in terms of the international register or even the regional registers, what has been its impact beyond a nation, state, or region? This will help us decide where it fits in the scheme of things. If it's had an impact outside its country or outside the region, that is what we're talking about here. And how would its loss impoverish the heritage of humanity? What would happen if we lost this particular item of documentary heritage? These are all points you need to answer in the statement of significance. But you remember, once you've written this, you can then go back to your summary and you put the key points from this in your summary at the front of the paper. So these are the parts of the document that we have discovered people have most problems with, which is why I've focused on them. They're the key points that we need to have addressed. We certainly will be helping you with any of these when we come to the workshop, and I hope that this has made it a bit clearer for you as you fill out your nomination form. So thank you.